Okay, ladies and gentlemen, the door is closed, which is the sign that we should get on with things. My name is Michael Walsh. I'm the Associate Chair for Research from the School of Art, Design and Media at NTU. And it's my great pleasure this afternoon to introduce Tor, who's a prize-winning science communicator, and he's certainly earned the accolade with over 20 published books, all translated into a number of different languages. It's a great honor for ADM in collaboration with Paralimes to have Tor as a visiting scientist with us. It's wonderful to have people coming in and going out and giving a talk and a lecture and a presentation, but it's much nicer when you can hold on to them for a little while and you can make them do several presentations, teach a few graduate students, and help us to keep the connections between ADM and Paralimes growing stronger and stronger. We've been doing it with Andrea's project on heritage science. There's other projects afoot that I'm aware of to do with refugee education, and now this is yet another bridge. So ADM and Paralimes, we're very, very pleased are working close together. Of course, at the School of Art, Design and Media, there's no contradiction in this, and there's certainly no surprise. Anyone who's involved in art, design or media will know that it is a complex science. It is engaged with the world that we live in. It is a very legitimate form of research. So that Tor should join us and help us to link together science, art, the environment, the complexities of everyday life is a great honor, and we're delighted that you can spend so much time with us. I look forward to the talk, which is called Commonities and the Complexity of Everyday Life, not least because when I read the abstract, there's that alluring reference to Singapore, which as yet I don't understand. So I'm looking forward to hearing about that. So Tor, may I just introduce you to our guests today in the same way that I introduced you at ADM a few weeks ago by saying, ladies and gentlemen, a scholar who needs no introduction at all, Tor.
Thank you, Michael, and thank you for your kind reception here. I'm very happy to be here in Singapore because Singapore is really the place where it all started. The story that I'm going to tell essentially starts with the first trail coming out of Singapore 66 years ago in 1949, when a young British physicist had taken a job at Raffles College, which later became the National University of Singapore. Derek de Solla Price, young British physicist, wanting to become a historian of science, goes to Raffles College, having a job, and he learns that this unbuilt library has ordered back issues of the Philosophical Transactions of the Royal Society of London from the start in 1662 until the time he was there, just before the Second World War. So that's several centuries of books. They were nicely bound in calfskin, and the only problem was that the library wasn't built yet. So Derek de Solla Price was a generous person, so he offered to take them in custody. He offered to take them home to his apartment, and he put them in his bedroom. He wanted to read through these several hundred years of science journal in a year. So the best place, obviously, was to put him in his bedroom, and he stacked the books decade by decade on the shelf in his bedroom, and he was very surprised. He later told that he was very surprised that he saw this fantastic curve that these stacks of books were showing on the volumes of the journal when he stacked them in his bedroom, because it turned out that they were showing this curve. That the early years of publication, the stack wasn't that high, and then it grew like this at a curve that was even at that time recognizable as the exponential curve. It has had a lot of press since '49, but it was obvious to him that there was something weird here. Why would this nice pile-up of books happen when he just stacked them decade by decade? And he started looking in other places to see if there was other phenomena in the publication of scientific results that looked like this. And indeed, everywhere he looked, he found that there was this exponential growth in the amount of journals, in the pages of journals, in the number of articles in journals, in the number of abstracts. This is the abstracts of scientific papers. And there was exponential growth everywhere he looked. And here you will see, for instance, the physics abstracts from the 1900s. You will see that you have two sort of bumps on the curve, which are the two world wars, where at least the publication of abstracts is delayed a little, but then the curve goes happily on afterwards. So it's a very robust and very strong phenomenon that you have this exponential growth. And he wasn't afraid to call it the most important law of the history of science and of sociology of science. That's any parameter at all he could measure, science showed exponential growth. Now, exponential growth is a very interesting kind of growth that he explored in this book, Little Science, Big Science, where he tried to study in many different ways how this exponential growth happens. Because what's characteristic of an exponential growth is that it can basically be explained from within. If you have a lot of rabbits that breed, and that's his example, these rabbits will breed until there are no more carrots to eat or somebody eats the rabbits. You don't have to instruct them to breed at an exponential rate. They'll do that as long as they can. So you don't need any external explanations to explain an exponential growth. You can do that just by looking at the inside of the system. And that is a very important feature. But of course, at some level, at some stage of development, the rabbits can no longer breed, and you will have this, as he called it, logistic curve. I think nowadays people mostly call it the S-sloped curve, where the growth ends and saturates because there's no more carrots or too many humans eating rabbits or whatever it is. So at some stage it will end. And his prediction was in the 60s, when he published this curve, that science would meet this saturation limit within the foreseeable future. And indeed, in the 1980s, sociologists of science like Barry Barnes started talking about science meeting the saturation limit. The budgets were no longer unlimited. The budgets didn't just grow with the rest of society, but the states entered into the working of science, and scientists obviously has been very unhappy with that ever since. But the important feature here is that it's determined from within, from inner mechanisms of the way sciences operate together. And it turned out that this simple law of exponential growth fostered a lot of studies of how science was produced, how scientists chose to publish, how they would cite and quote each other, how they would refer to each other's work. And in the 1960s, a guy called Warren Hagstrom, and a sociology of science in the American tradition of sociology of science, founded by Robert Merton, he coined this law of science, the basic law of how science is published, which is that the individual scientist wants the recognition of his peers, and to get that, he has to offer a gift of information, of new knowledge, of insight. So he offers this contribution, as it's called, of scientific knowledge, and what he gets in return is recognition. The recognition by the peers is then the route to get money for funding or jobs or people helping in the lab or whatever it is. But the important thing is that to get the money, you need the recognition first. Recognition is a road to money, and it's not the other way around, that you can buy recognition. You have to give information as a gift and then get back recognition as a gift. It's not something you can buy. And this concept of gift giving that that Hagstrom explained as the organizing principle of science is a very important principle that was well known at the time to anthropologists, but unknown in most other scientific circles. There was a French guy, Marcel Mauss. He lived in the area of France close to Germany, so you pronounce him Mauss. Published a book about the gift, in 1924, which was very important in that he showed that many so-called primitive societies, that is non-industrial, non-market economy societies, are organized with gift giving as the principle that binds people together. Because when you give a gift to someone, you establish a relationship that is not terminated by the simple act of giving. That's different from a commodity. If you want to sell someone a commodity, you get the money, he gets the jeep, and then there's no more. The relationship is over. But when you give a gift, there's some idea that you might get something back at some time later, but it's not immediate, so there's established some kind of relationship, which is very different from commodity exchange, which is, of course, the dominant way of exchanging things in the market economy. This is important because this recognition, which you are then given as a gift from the community in return for the gift of new knowledge that you give, this recognition can show up in many different ways, but the most important way that people started studying in the wake of Solar Price's discovery of this structure of scientific publications and citations was that citing the results of another scientist is a very important way to recognize the importance of his work. And so citations became an important measure to see how other scientists would recognize someone. And in the 50s, sociologists studied how could recognition be used as a measurement of quality in science, because usually quality in science was seen as something that some kind of headquarter would determine, some kind of grand old man who would say who was good and who was bad. But here was a mechanism dealing with peer-to-peer relationships, one scientist quoting another scientist. Would that in fact lead to the same measure of quality or of importance to the scientific community? And it turned out that there was full correspondence between the number of citations that a scientist would get and the way that he would traditionally be evaluated as a good or bad scientist by the Old Boys Network or the Nobel Committee in Stockholm or whatever. There was a full correspondence. Of course, now people, because of these results, which are now more than 50 years old, people are then using clever strategies to get a lot of citations, and therefore it's more complicated, but that's always the problem when you measure social systems. But here it's very clear that the peer-to-peer citation corresponds with the traditional indicator of quality from the Old Boys Network. And this was an extremely important result because it means that when people exchange knowledge and recognition at a very local level, peer-to-peer in the labs, in their everyday work, without thinking about the prestige of the other guy, but just this work was important, then it leads to a very regular global behavior where you can see on the global scale of the research community laws like the growth laws and laws of citation that are very robust. So somehow from bottom up you can organize this kind of system. And this is the first example of a mechanism that I'll try to follow here in different contexts, which is a very important and in my eyes maybe the most important mechanism in recent history. That the peer-to-peer system will lead to a bottom-up organization at the general level. Now, the next example is 10 years younger than the Solar Prize in '49 in Singapore. And that's a guy in Santa Monica in California, Los Angeles, a young guy called Paul Barron. He was an electrical engineer, and he was hired by RAND Corporation, a think tank in Santa Monica that is mainly funded by the American Air Force. You shouldn't worry about that because in the 50s, a lot of basic research in the United States was financed by the military. And even though this is not a nice thing, it was still the tradition. And RAND Corporation got enormous amounts of money from the Air Force, and they had this bright young guy, and they said to him, please work on the problem that you consider to be the most important problem in the world. We don't want to influence that, just go do something really important. And this guy said, okay, I take the most important problem in the world today, which is the risk of a nuclear war started by misinterpretation between the United States and the USSR. As you know, at that time, they were armed to the teeth with these nuclear weapons, and there was a very distinct risk that they would start a nuclear war just by misunderstanding each other. And he said, I want to see how I can do something to help that. And what he immediately arrived at was that the big problem, the instability, came from the communication systems. Because the traditional communication system used in society and in the army was a centralized system where you had some guy in the middle or a telephone operator in the middle doing the telephone switches. I read recently that like between 10 and 20% of women in American cities in the start of last century were actually employed as telephone operators, because it was a very tedious technology. But maybe if you're as old as me, you can remember when you made a telephone call, you actually talked to a human operator and asked them for something. And the point was that if someone here at the end of a periphery of the system wants to talk to someone else at the other end, it always has to go through the center. Which means that if the switching lady is in the ladies' room, nobody can talk to each other. Or if there's a strike going on here, or if there's a nuclear war going on here. And of course, the problem with the nuclear war is that the very first thing an analysis from the same RAND corporation showed since the mid-50s, that the first thing anyone would do in a nuclear war was to try to bomb the headquarters and the nuclear weapons of the opponent. So the very first thing anyone would do was to take out the headquarters of the other guy, because then you would be left with all these guys in the periphery that wouldn't know what to do. Then, of course, the analysis would show that if you have a general here who has this rocket with a nuclear bomb and he can't call the president and ask, should I fire or not? He's likely to fire because he doesn't want the criticism for not doing what he should have done, so he fires, and that happens at both sides, and the world goes basically under. So Barron's analysis was the vulnerability of the headquarters. The fact that we now have a nuclear weapon on the tip of a rocket means that you can never protect your headquarters. So this is very vulnerable because you take out the headquarters and nobody can communicate and things go amok. So he invented a system where you had a distributed system modeled over the central nervous system of biological creatures, where there are many different alternative routes any message can take, so that you can take out a large number of points in this network and it still functions, like biological systems do. No headquarter, distributed system in this flat network where you could use digital technology to make it very, very robust to disturbances. And he tried to make the American telephone company build such a system. They refused in the mid-60s. In the late 60s, people started building networks like these with the ARPANET, again financed by the military. The ARPANET grew into bigger networks that were, together with other networks, became what we know as the Internet. So this is the basic architecture of the Internet. Get rid of headquarters and distribute everything to make them robust. And if you compare these two networks, it's interesting here. I had an artist redraw this original drawing by Barron for a book, and he noticed something which is very obvious when you see it, but I hadn't noticed, that in fact it's the same dots in these two illustrations. So they look very, very different, but it's just the way our eye, already in the way it perceives things, we'll see it's a different world, but it is in fact the very same dots. So the headquarter, in a way is the theme of our time. Maybe we haven't discovered it yet, but it is in the sense that it organizes by far the most important technology of our time, the Internet. And as you know, the Internet has given rise to a culture of open source programming, where people give away their programs for prestige or for later jobs or whatever. The Internet is heavily influenced by gift giving as an organizing principle, very much alike the academic tradition. And the Internet has given rise to something which is even more remarkable and which is based on the tradition of studying scientific citations dating back to Derek DeSolla Prize in Singapore. And this is a paper published around 1998 by Sergey Brin and Lawrence Page, two young students at Stanford in computer science who had this idea that they could build this huge web search engine that they called Google, which was based on academic citation literature applied to the web. So they're basically using the ideas from the sociology of science, that you can measure the quality of a paper by how many people refer to that paper. And you can make an algorithm for that, and the page rank algorithm, which is the basic fundamental idea behind Google, is based on this sociology of science. And this led to the idea of the Web 2.0, that is the internet or the World Wide Web as interface to the internet, where it's not the content providers from traditionally that provide the content. It's not the media houses or the libraries or universities that provide the content. It's the users. The users help each other. And because the basic idea behind the academic study of citations is that the more people use something, the more useful it is. And therefore, the more people link to a web page, the more likely it is to be useful to someone searching for a web page about avocados. So you don't just want any web page about avocados, you want the one that most people would refer to. So Web 2.0 is about using the collective intelligence of all the users, learning from what other people do. And again, of course, here you have the theme of the peer-to-peer interaction, as opposed to the headquarter, which you had traditionally, where some librarian or some professor or some gatekeeper would tell you what you should read if you were interested in avocados. Now you can go for what most people who deal with avocados actually read, rather than what the librarian or the professor tells you to read. So the headquarters are not as strong, the collective intelligence is very strong, and we have bottom up, and we have a co-creation of content here. So our third trail then takes us also United States, also the 60s. There's a little difference here. It's a guy called John F. Kennedy who gives a speech at Rice University in Houston, in Texas. A very famous speech, because in this speech in 1962, he announces the American plan to go to the moon. And as a politician, he has to argue, why would I go to the moon? And he says, well, it's like climbing the mountains or flying across the Atlantic. We do these things, and we go to the moon, not because they're easy, but because they're hard. You don't hear politicians talk that way today. They would say because it will contribute jobs to the economy, or it's the cheap way to do things. Actually, I think number 7 reason he gave in this speech was the economy and the jobs. But mainly it was about doing something that is so difficult to do, so hard to do, that it will measure our competences and show how good we are and make us more clever. And of course, this all was about the Russians. They had Gagarin, they had Sputnik. He wanted to show that Americans could also do things. So in a sense, this show of power, this not because it's easy, but because it's hard, is about showing your power. But it's also about knowing that doing this will learn us a lot of things that we didn't expect. Like, many people thought that this moon landing was the beginning of the space age. And as you all know, it really turned out to be the beginning of the Earth age. That going to the moon gave us this image of the planet, which was a wonderful image, which became the icon of the environmental consciousness that came in those same years, in the late 60s, early 70s. So in a way, we discovered Earth rather than the moon, but we had to go to the moon to discover Earth, like you often have to go to other people to know who you are. So in this very simple movement, a lot of new things were explored, and one of the things that were explored was something that looks a little like the planet Earth, but is a bit smaller. This is a small bowl of glass, a small sphere of glass called an ecosphere, and inside that ecosphere you have a coral, which is not very important. You have some small shrimps swimming around. You have some algae and some bacteria. And the funny thing about this little system, that I have one at home, you can buy one for like 100 Sing dollars. It's very cute and very nice to see these 3 shrimps swimming around. in this water, because what you realize when you start thinking about it is that this glass sphere is closed. There's nobody feeding the shrimps, so they're the most easy to keep pets in the world. And you don't have to take out the litter because it's a very simple closed system. These are different commercial versions. It's a closed system where you have the bacteria and the algae and the shrimps. The shrimps will swim around and look funny. The bacteria will then eat the waste from the shrimps, make it into nutrients to the algae. The algae will do photosynthesis with the daylight, and that will produce food and oxygen, and the shrimps will take in the food and inhale the oxygen and burn it, and from this combustion they get the energy to swim around. This was done because people wanted to explore the possibility of having closed ecosystems for space travel. But for us here, it's a very pedagogical way of understanding what's happening on our planet, because this is a very simple system. It's the same atoms. Nothing goes in, nothing goes out. The only thing that goes in is daylight, and they can swim around happily for years. Because the basic law of the system is that the food of one guy is the waste of the another guy, and this waste of the other guy then becomes the food of the third guy. And all life on Earth works like that, except humans for the past few hundred years. We've sort of stepped out of that simple law that food equals waste. If you don't eat something that another guy has as a leftover, you will run out of food very quickly. And if nobody eats your shit, it will pile up in your little glass bowl very quickly. No other creature on the earth makes shit that nobody else wants to eat apart from us. And we make shit that we bury deep down in the earth as nuclear waste, and we dig up stuff from the earth to burn. It's a weird strategy we're on. Because the simple system in the ecosphere is that all you need to add is daylight, and then the atoms will just jump from shrimp to bacteria to algae and out into the water and back, and the same atoms will go on forever in this daylight. And of course it's the same with this bigger thing, that you have the same. This is a generalized diagram where you not only have algae but also plants, not only shrimps but also other animals, and not only bacteria, but also many other kinds of bacteria. But the basic network is the same, that one guy eats the other guy's leftovers. And that's the simple way it runs, and all you need is this daylight from outside. There's lots of it. This is the amount of solar energy that arrives at the surface of the Earth. This is the amount that, for instance, is converted into wind energy or hydro energy. And this is the total global consumption of energy, Americans included, that humankind uses. And what I don't really understand is why engineers insist that it's not possible from this big cube to extract this little cube. But they say that's very difficult. I don't understand why. It must be because we have been on the wrong technological path for many, many years. We've insisted on depot sources of energy, like the fossil sources that we dig out of the planet, or the nuclear sources like the uranium we dig out of the planet, instead of using the enormous flow of energy going through our environment in the form of solar, wind, and wave, biomass, and all that. It's about 10,000 times the amount we actually use. But we are somehow used to this idea that we should cling to depots, and my simple claim here is that this is really the source of all our problems. We have to get online with the sunshine again. We have to go into that flow and learn to take the flow of daylight as it comes. It's gently distributed everywhere for everyone. It's just a question of developing the technology to reach out and grab it, like the windmills or the solar panels or whatever. But we seem to be slow at that because we put all our technological effort into the depot energy, and that's a big problem. All you need is light is sort of the motto for the new kind of civilization we have to build. It's a very simple motto. It's a very simple thing, and it takes then a lot of engineering to do it because we need a lot of help to have this renewable energy where we need it and when we need it. So you'll say, what has this to do with citations and books in Singapore? Well, to understand that, we need to go to Samsø. Samsø you have not heard about. You notice this odd letter, which is also in my name. a friend here said, oh, that's the empty mathematical set. So would that be sort of what's inside my head, or is Samsø just the empty mathematical set? No, Samsø is a beautiful little island, which is world famous, although it's a very small island, and it's world famous because of these windmills out there on the ocean, and also other windmills on the actual island. Here you see it. It's got like 4,000 inhabitants. It's 114 square kilometers, so it's small even by Danish standards. These next 3 slides I borrowed from a very good friend who lives at Samsø, who goes around the world all the time lecturing about Samsø and their experience, because he then explains where's this little island located. And he explains, well, it's in the center of Denmark. You'll see here that Samsø is really in the center of Denmark. This is Samsø. This is Denmark. You might not be familiar with Denmark, but you know, Samsø means where you get together. Sam means together, and Ø means island. So it's the island where you get together, and basically this is very, very old story. I mean, you find many Stone Age leftovers there. My daughter found a small little stone, an axe, just by walking around. There's a lot of Stone Age people were here. A lot of Vikings were here. The name Samsø comes from the Viking time, where all the Viking ships would meet here and agree on how to raid Britain and whatever they were doing. So it's a very important island in the middle of Denmark, handily put there. And as my friend from Samsø says, Denmark really is then in the middle of Europe, as you know. Basically Denmark, and thereby Samsø, is in the middle of the world. They tend to get a little sort of overexcited about themselves at Samsø, and I can understand that, because, I mean, just for instance, 1 month ago, New York Times, green energy inspiration off the coast of Denmark. I mean, you've got these Samsø guys here, and sort of what kind of guys are they that regularly go into the New York Times, and why do they do that? Well, they do that because not only have they put up these windmills, 10 offshore and I think 13 on land, so that they have become a net exporter of renewable energy. This island is an exporter of energy. They have the windmills and they have some biomass burning. There are 4,000 people. They did it together. They did it as a community. They financed the whole thing. They agreed upon the whole thing together. And when the many visitors come to this island and ask, how did you do this? What is this about? The first day or two, they want to see the windmills. And then, of course, they pretty quickly conclude that we've seen windmills before. The real deal here is that you did it together. You did it as a community. So this guy here, Søren Hermansen, who is the director of the Samsø Energy Academy and was the driving force behind this whole revolution at Samsø, this energy revolution at Samsø, this guy, again, in New York Times, that's the same article from January. This guy, he says, well, we need to understand this community thing. Why could we do this as a community, and what does it mean that we did it together as a community? And he came to me and he said, we have to write a book to explain what a community is and why communities work well for this. And we wrote this book with a Danish title. Here's another interesting letter that you wouldn't know. We have 3 odd letters. You see both Søren and I have the empty set in our names. And you've got this A. So you wouldn't understand this. But it's a pun on words in Danish. We had to invent a new word in English to make the same pun. That what we were advocating was the phenomenon of commonities, which is when communities deal with commons. I'll try to explain that. You can read the book on Kindle at Amazon, and it's a mixture of theory of communities and commons. That's my part, and stories about how they did it at Samsø. That's the part of Søren Hermansen, who was son of a peasant, and is a very concrete and wonderful person that can tell very specific stories about how they did. But the starting point for us was that community is kind of a fluffy word. Everybody likes communities, and nobody knows what they mean when they say community, and not many people use it in the same way. going back to Raymond Williams, an English theorist, he said that it's just about the only word that you always use in a positive sense in the social sciences. State or market or whatever, there will always be people who don't like, but community, everybody likes community, and everybody would like to be part of a community. And Søren and my problem was that that's not interesting. It's not interesting, you know, just to be part of a community, to be part of a community. There must be something more to that community, and we have to realize that communities are not always nice, but they're necessary. And our first observation was that communities are just like children. You know, children, that's the most wonderful and the most fantastic and the most elating and the most spirit-raising thing that can happen in your life is interacting with children. Nothing can make you as happy and make life feel as meaningful as interacting with children. But you also know that there's nothing in life that can make you so impatient and so unhappy with life and so much feel that, could this just end? I mean, take me and throw me away when you deal with small kids that continue to cry all night, or just teenagers or whatever. Children will make you as unhappy as you will ever get, and children will make you as happy as you will ever get. It would be politically incorrect of me to say you could say the same thing about women, but you can certainly say the same thing about communities. There's nothing as tiring as a community of people who are not generous. But that's the worst thing that can happen in your life. But there's nothing as wonderful as when you actually work together with people. I want to explore why this is. Why is it that communities are just like children? Children are there for a reason. That's our biological sort of essence. We want children and we want them to grow up. Communities, there must also be a reason for them. They must deal with something, and they must deal with something else than just being together and being a community. Because communities that are just about being a community are not really interesting. The interesting thing is communities that deal with something else. And of course, the important thing is communities dealing with commons. Commons, as you may know, is a concept, is an old concept for something that doesn't belong to anyone, something that is not owned by anyone, something that is not regulated by anyone, but is just out there as a common resource that everybody can use. And there are many examples of commons in our lives. The classic is the open meadows. You have this little village, and farmers own their land or whatever. And then on the periphery of the village, there's this open grass field where the cattle can go to grass. It's not owned or regulated by anyone. It's just shared. Or we have like the oceans. Traditionally, were just a common. We have the atmosphere, which somehow is not owned by anyone. We start regulating what you can do to it, but it's not owned by anyone, not even Microsoft. You have language, which is a shared resource. The moment somebody owned language and could actually tell you what words you can use and not use, language would die very quickly. Language only develops and flourishes because everybody contributes and uses it. Culture has in many aspects of this, and a phenomenon like silence, for instance, going on a train, is also a shared common thing. Not regulated by anyone, but you have these annoying people who don't want to share that common, and you wonder if you should shout at them that they should shut up, and you get into problems and get off the train. But commons are sort of unregulated. And so when we say that the interesting thing is communities that want to deal with commons, that wants to regulate commons, and we call them commonities with this word that doesn't exist in the English language. It's because we want to say, here is something that is very important if you want to look at commons or if you want to look at communities. Now, the traditional discussion of commons that most of you will be familiar with dates back to 1968, where Garrett Hardin, an ecologist, made an argument which has played a huge role in policy, in political science and economy, and that's what he calls the tragedy of the commons. Because the tragedy of the commons is this idea that you have this meadow outside the village and everybody can put their cattle out to graze, but everybody also understands that not too many cows, because they will eat it all. So everybody has to hold back a little, not to put too many cows out there, because if it's overgrazed, the grass dies and there's nothing for anyone. And so there's an agreement on how many cows can be out there. And then his idea of the tragedy of the commons is that every single farmer will think, I can put just one more cow out there, and it won't ruin the grass. And if every farmer thinks, oh, I can put one more out there, you know the feeling. I can do it, but the rest shouldn't do it. If everyone thinks that way, it ends up that everybody says, in fact, put one more cow out there, and the grass is grazed too much and goes away. And that's the tragedy of the commons. Everybody thinks, I can cheat a little, the rest can't. And therefore commons break down, and Hardin's argument was basically that the market has to take over, somebody has to own it and charge people for putting cows out there, or the state has to regulate it. But then comes this lady, Elinor Ostrom, an American political scientist who studied another phenomenon than the tragedy of the commons, which you could call the triumph of the commons, or the triumph of the communities, actually, because the point is that there are many, many examples from around the world that communities of people can govern their commons in a way that is more efficient than when the market tries to do it or when the state tries to do it. Examples are lobster catchers in the state of Maine, United States, where it was very difficult to make actually an official regulation, but when they agreed upon a way to regulate the amount of lobsters they could fish, it turned out to work. You have the regulation of water in Bali. You have many examples around the world where communities are very good at regulating commons because people actually look each other in the eyes and make agreements, and that's more stable than when there are imposed rules from the outside. So sometimes self-organization is stronger than the market and the state. It's the idea of Elinor Ostrom, and when I dated her as 2009, that's not because that was when she made most of her work, that was earlier than that. That was the year she got the Nobel Prize in Economy for this discovery that commons could be regulated by communities. So here again, it's the same idea that it's bottom-up, it's people organizing themselves rather than the headquarter intervening. It's not really a market thing because it's more like a gift economy. People cooperate to do things. It's not really the state because it's about human contact. There's no money involved and no laws involved, and that is sometimes a more effective way to regulate stuff than by using the state or the market. And in a sense, you could say what's happening here is that the civil society, which is the part of human interactions which is not regulated by the market or by the state, but the everyday life of human beings in the civil society is taking over as being stronger than the traditional headquarter systems. And now, what is this civil society? Civil society is what makes up most of your day. Most of what you experience in life, most of your everyday life is about civil society. That is voluntary interaction between human beings that do not exchange money for what they do, but just are nice to each other or care about each other or help each other, your colleagues, your neighbors, your family, your friends. Everybody helps each other all the time, and this is, in fact, the most important part of our life. And you could ask, why can there be this civil society? Why is it possible that we have this helping all the time, this community of people helping each other all the time? The crucial remark in this context is the remark, oh, but you didn't have to. You know, when somebody does something for you, holds the door, shares with you a cake, or help your kids to come home from school when you're late from your work or whatever, and you say, oh, but you didn't have to. That is when it's an act of generosity, when it's something that they were not obliged to do but did out of niceness. That is really the generosity thing, the thing that is about people helping each other. And my claim is this is the normal mode of human operation. That's what you're used to. This is what fills up most of your day. Money transaction, you go to a shop. Dealing with the law, you don't do that a lot. But interacting with normal people in civil society, you do that all the time. You exchange gifts with other people, and you would say, but gifts, why are gifts so important? And we come back to this Marcel Mauss guy in his book from 1924, because he argues that the organizing principle of so-called primitive societies, like ones in Polynesia he studies, is the idea of how, which is the spirit of the gift. You give a gift to someone, with that gift comes a how. And that how, that spirit wants to get back to you. And the only way the other guy can give that how back to you is by, at some later stage, giving you a present back, a gift back. Which means that in the time in between, you have a relationship with him. He has got this how, and he wants to give it back to you, but not too quickly, because then it's not a gift, it's just an exchange. So it builds relationships. So the idea is that since commodity exchange is finished when it's finished, gift giving is more useful in building relationships in societies because it is not finished. This is the idea of anthropology, and they apply it to so-called primitive societies. But of course, the point is we're living in a market economy, and do gifts play a role for us except for Christmas or the organized gift festivities? And it does. If you start thinking about your life, in your family, do you charge family members for dinner? No. You just give them dinner. The only money exchange you have in families is like when you pay a teenager to clean up their room, but that's about it. Your neighbors, you help your neighbors, you ask your neighbors for help. You don't put money in that. There's no state regulation saying help thy neighbor. Networks of colleagues, the so-called black economy, the unofficial economy where people don't sort of tell the tax authorities about what they do, but just help each other. A lot of our everyday life is about all these small gifts that we give different people. And you would say, yes, but how much? And you look in the anthropological literature, and it's very difficult to see how much it is. But it turns out, actually, that you can find very cleverly made estimates that it's just about half of everything human beings produce ends up as gifts. There's a Dutch economist called Wilfred Dolsma who made this clever argument based on United Nations statistics saying that half of what human beings produce never gets into the market economy. This was from a report where they wanted to find out how much work do women do and how much work do men do. Typically, men are in the market economy getting wages and so on, while women are working at home. And then you estimate how much work is done by women, and work is everything somebody else could have done for you. Like if I prepare a dinner for my family, I could have bought that too. If I brush my teeth, that's difficult to buy, so that's not really work. But taking care of kids or doing dinners is work. And so they come up with this politically correct answer that half of everything humanity produces ends up as gifts in the families. Typically as the work of women. So women contribute as much as men to the total work volume of humanity. And that's a nice politically correct answer. But it's also an indication that at least at this order of magnitude of 1 to 1, gifts are as important in our everyday life as commodities are. And this brings us back, of course, to the gift economy of science, that you exchange recognition for information, that you give a gift, a contribution, and you get the appreciation of others. Our social life is that you're generous to other people, and they'll give you back a relationship. And the more generous and the longer time you've been generous to people, the stronger the bond is, the stronger the relationship is. So this is very important in our everyday life. Here's a woman called Barbara Fredrickson. She's a psychologist, part of the psychology movement called positive psychology. She developed a wonderful concept of the broaden and build theory of positive emotions. Why do we have nice feelings like I'm happy, I'm relaxed, I'm oceanic? Because you can easily understand all the negative feelings, emotions like I hate this, or I'm afraid of this. That's biologically obviously meaningful to be afraid of a tiger and then run away, or to be aggressive about someone who wants to do bad things to your kids or something. But why would biology develop a feeling like I'm so happy today? Oh, this is a nice day. Why would you do that? Her idea is to broaden and build. That is to broaden your horizon and to build your relationships and to build your body. You need relaxed emotions, because they tell you there's no tiger. I'm now ready to go over the hillside and see if there are any more berries over there. So it's a way to make you explorative and constructive and optimistic. To build social relationships is basically optimistic. And she came up 2 years ago in a book called Love 2.0 with this fantastic concept of the micro moment. The micro moment is a moment where two people interact, for instance, on the sidewalk. They can be strangers, in the way where they have a synchronized gaze at each other. Like you meet someone in the street and you step on the side for him or her to come by you. And if you're like a European in Singapore and you're not used to people moving naturally on the left side, because everybody in your own country goes on the right side, you constantly have these, you bump into people, and sometimes you negotiate with the other guy. Okay, he looks like a European, he'll go the wrong way, okay, I go the wrong way too. And you smile back at him, oh, that was kind of you. And you have these small micro moments where you sort of, that was nice. And if you think about your everyday life, if you have positive micro moments in the morning, the rest of your day will be wonderful. If you have negative micro moments, it takes a few hours to get over it. Every time you sort of, I angry at people, it kills them a little. So micro moment is the way that we feel this yoo-hoo when we interact with other people. So the point here is that micro moments will build up trust between people. If you have a lot of micro moments together with people, you will build up something bigger, like what she calls Love 2.0. So the point is, there's a continuum from building up trust in a society that you just basically have nice interactions with other people, to the people you have a long history of interactions with, a large number of micro moments that will build up friendship, build up strong bonds, build up even romantic love. So it's an accumulation that will make you feel this thing. And it's about eye contact, it's about the interaction between faces, it's about developing this trustful feeling of trusting the other guy that's so nice. And there's massive biological evidence that we are deeply connected, that we have so many emotions that where we mirror each other, where we learn from each other, where we sort of go into a state of like mimicry or contagion or empathy, where we mirror the emotional states of others, and we can even have more advanced feelings like sympathy and compassion and pro-social behavior. And this is all happening more or less unconsciously. We're not aware of all the time we are connected to other people. So it happens all the time. Here's a Danish child cartoon of a guy who has fire in his pants, and the other guy who's upset by it. And the text says that the one guy's pants catches fire, and the other guy, Bill, said a swear because Bill had chosen Ben's pants to wear. So this guy is having this guy's pants on, and they're on fire. And this, in a way, is a symbol of the very simple way that we are all connected. We are wearing each other's pants all the time. And if you want to take care of yourself, you have to take care of other people. If you want to take care of other people, you have to take care of yourself. Because we are so connected, we are so coupled. And you would say, he's very naive, this Danish guy. Because, I mean, there are people who don't want to take care of others, but who find pleasure in not taking care of other people, like sadists. Or you have people like masochists who need to suffer to be happy. And yes, these people exist, and we have names for them. But the normal human interaction is just like this. So the normal human interaction is that we actually want to take care of other people because it gives us pleasure, and we want to take care of ourselves because it's good towards other people. And then we just exclude the masochists, the sadists, and the lawyers, and other people who are not into that game. So if you're a really good egoist, you do nice things to other people in altruism. So what's going to happen now? So if I argue here the civil society is extremely important, it is the way to govern the commons, to share the resources. What's going to happen next? What's going to happen next? And this, you might say that what I've already said was not well-founded, but this now, of course, is mere speculation. What's going to happen now is that the headquarters will become more and more unproductive in human life. We live in a period where we seem to have more and more headquarters and bigger cities, and if you take the archaeology and the history of humanity and you just sort of extend the line, it seems that the cities will be very big. I argue the opposite. I argue headquarters are becoming unproductive, not only because of nuclear weapons, but for many other reasons. Because the expansive civilization is about to peak. There's an end to the logic we've been in for at least 500 or really truly 10,000 years since the advent of agriculture. This no longer works. And this means that the globalization process we're in at the moment will look more like a localization process in the coming decades. And why is that so? That is so because we basically already have all the atoms we will ever get to circle around in our little fish bowl. There's no more atoms coming in. If you take, for instance, the amount of copper in the crust of the Earth that is available for us with normal economic and technological skills that we have these days, we have already used up half of the available copper in the Earth's crust. And we are the 1 billion people who did so from 1900 and for the past century and 15 years. There are other people on this planet who also want copper for their civilization. So they will probably pay more for the copper than the people from the first world who started using up all the copper. And the highest concentration of copper today in the crust of the planet is no longer in the copper mines, but in the cities. In every city on this planet, there's about 225 kilograms of copper per citizen in the infrastructure, in the cars, in the apparatus, in the kitchen, in the gold medals from the Olympic Games and whatever, or the bronze medals, in the statues. And people are now stealing copper, you know, from power lines and stealing copper from the graveyards and so on, because basically we have all the atoms we'll ever get. There are people dreaming about mining forever, and yes, dream on. But the reality is, basically, we have all the atoms we'll ever get. If you want copper today at an economical price, take it from the cities. Don't expect to find another continent with a new copper mine. So the whole logic of civilization is now turning to dig where you are. It's already there. It's a problem of getting the atoms to circulate again in your little fish bowl. And to do that, you need weird stuff like urban mining, where your mine is the city. You need urban agriculture, where the space you need to grow plants in the sunlight that falls everywhere, as you know, is maybe the roof or the sides of the buildings, is maybe the open spaces in the city, because if really these cities spread like they do, we have to make food there also. We need all kind of green technology where we retrofit what we already have, so it's not as wasteful with energy, which means manual labor in the industrialized countries. The process of sending everything to China to be produced there doesn't work when people in existing cities need to change their buildings into becoming green. We will have the 3D printers where manufacture will no longer be in the old way. It will be adding small stuff on top of each other. You take your biopolymer, you put it into a 3D printer, you buy the recipe for the cup you want to produce from someone, or you share it with someone in an open source way, and you can print your cups or your cars or your houses in your neighborhood. WikiHouse is a movement of architects that now makes 3D printable houses for slum areas and probably soon also for well-off people. So production is going to move back to where people are in the first place and not away from it. Globalization is a period that was very important, but it's not so important anymore in the future. And of course, communities regulating all this together are going to be very important. And it's very important when you think about the future of society to provide the infrastructure and the crafts for all this. So we have to keep the crafts and the ideas alive for all of this. So what I claim here is that we will be seeing a relocalization of production and the way to get resources, and that it will necessarily revitalize the communities, and it will reawaken the role of the civil society. And you will say, civil society, I mean, what is he really talking about? And my point is, civil societies have been there all the time. We just didn't notice them, because we were so obsessed with the state and the market, and the right wing was for the market, and the left wing was for the state, and everything was about state or market, and that was all we were discussing. And maybe we were only discussing half of society, or even less than that. Civil society has been there all the time, and it's not a vague or distant or sort of hippie-like idea. It's the very surface and the very workings of society. It's the very thing that people look for when they look for the intangible part of economy. Denmark, my own home country, has been unreasonably rich when you compare it to the amount of resources we have. And people have been discussing for many years, why are we so rich in this little country? And the answer quite clearly is social capital, is trust, civil society, people trusting each other. It means lower transaction costs. It's a good business model for a country to have this civil society running well. So the whole point here is that there's a challenge here for science, for social science, and for complexity sciences to understand mechanisms by which peer-to-peer relationships and peer-to-peer liking each other will actually organize into a global behavior that's meaningful. For instance, to model how accumulation of micro-moments, which is a simple little reward model, how that will mean that you have either an escalation of trust in a society or you have an escalation of untrust in a society, and what consequences that has for more traditional economic transactions. Because basically, trust will lower transaction costs. And also, it's obvious that societies dominated by equality, like the Scandinavian countries, there's a much higher likelihood that a person you meet in the street is someone you're not afraid of, or someone who's not afraid of you. And therefore, there's a much higher likelihood that when you meet someone in the street in a Scandinavian country, you'll smile to that person rather than look frightened. And that will be a snowball running. So you could say also that equality in societies will lead to accumulation of micro-moments that will lower the transaction costs. So at the end here, what's more to say? Well, you know, Jan Fassbinder, our dear host here, has given all a challenge that he wants to know what the more is in this. The whole is more than the sum of the parts. You know, they always say that in complexity theory, the whole is more than the sum of the parts. And what is then this more, Jan asks. Now, if we apply all of what I've said to that question, you could say, what is characteristic of a well-functioning civil society? It is that there's no stories to tell. People go about doing their lives. It's rich, it's funny, it's wonderful, but there's nothing to tell. A well-functioning civil society is invisible from the outside. You don't talk about it. You don't see any effect from it, but people do their jobs, and kids go to schools, and everybody is happy. No stories to tell. It's like a family. You have 2 adults and 2 kids, and they make up 4 in a family, and it's nice, and they go to school, and they go to job, and everything works, and they have the neighbors over for dinner, and everything is fine. But the moment you split them up, the father starts drinking, the mother starts crying, and the kids start doing crime or whatever. In a sense, it's a simpler system to describe a happy family than an unhappy family. And likewise with this equation, 2 plus 2 is 4. It's easier to describe the 4 than the 2 plus 2, because the 4 could also be 7 minus 3 or other arithmetic. So there's less information in saying 4 than in saying 2 plus 2. So in the general thing about computation is you want to get rid of information. That's what computation is all about. Computational systems throw information away, so you end up with the 4. Now, getting rid of information is the essence of looking for structure or looking for results in something, which means that if you have a whole, if you have something that this is a person, this is a building, this is a society. If you have a good whole, it's a simple whole. It's a simple whole that you can describe in simple ways, like a building or a person or a society. That's really what we mean by a whole. It's easier to describe. If you take a building and you take all the bricks it was made out of and put these bricks in a big heap, they are more difficult to describe than the building. If you take a person like me and disintegrate me into atoms, that's going to be a mess that is more difficult to describe than the guy talking here. So a good whole is a simple whole, which simply means that A whole is a kind of order, and order is reduced information. This is in the very classical sense of information theory of Shannon, and all I'm saying here can be stated very explicitly in algorithmic information content theory of Gregory Chaitin, that a big structure, a whole, is easier to describe than the parts it's made of, which means very simply that the whole is less than the sum of the parts when you talk about information theory. And you can argue that information theory is all there is, in a sense. So the whole point is that the whole is less than the sum of the part. It's not more than the sum of the part, also in social systems. So when you say, you know, the famous statement, less is more, it comes from Robert Browning, a British poet, but it's mostly made famous by Mies van der Rohe, a German architect who worked in Chicago. Less is more, they say. My point is not less is more. My point is that less is the more. Less is the more of the whole is more than the sum of the parts, of its parts. So the whole point is, in a sense, the whole problem of complexity theory is looking in the wrong direction. It's looking for emerging more. It's not interesting. It's not what we are going for. What we are going for is less, is order, structure, recognizability, wholes. And that's also what we are looking for in society, and therefore we are not seeing the fact that the civil society is creating sort of the whole, the community is creating what binds society together. We are overlooking that. So all of that, I claim, is what follows from what happened in a bedroom in Singapore 66 years ago. Well, more or less. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Tor, for providing several micro moments for me today. Enjoyed that. Can we throw this open to the floor and take first question, please? Yes. Do you need a microphone?
I think, yeah. You have runners with microphones, I think. Yeah.
Oh.
Getting some exercise.
Can you hear me? Okay. Well, thank you for a very interesting talk. I was wondering whether you could comment a bit more on the sharing economy, like people sharing their cars and their couches and everything. How would that fit in all the ideas you already presented?
That's a very good point. Obviously, sharing economy is part of this logic. Sharing economy is about the civil society, in a sense, taking over part of what the market did for people, creating their own micro markets. And excuse me. And I think there are two things that are interesting observations on this. One thing is that it's really the irony of industrializing production, because in industrialized production, all objects aren't basically the same. I mean, all sofas are the same. So why is it that it's so important to have the same sofa and inherit the sofa from your parents like you did in the old days, if all sofas are the same? Why don't you just go to IKEA and say, I would like to get the sit-down service from IKEA for many years, and I want you to provide me with the sofa, but I don't want to keep the sofa after I've used it and throw it away. I want you to take it back to recycle the atoms in the sofa. This is far better for the environment, far better perhaps even for my economy. And I was arguing this in a television debate on the green economy some years ago in Denmark. And on the other side were a lot of people from business, one of them being the guy from IKEA. And after the cameras had closed down and the lights were out, he came over and he said, we are already into that. We are studying it when you argue this. So of course it's an interesting model primarily because it's good for the economy. The other reason is some Danes who have been involved in the car sharing industry, who produced a fantastic service for car sharing. They say it also has implications for the way people behave, because the moment people see their hardware as something they should share with other people, They get proud of their hardware, they get proud of their apartment, they get proud of their cars. They start being very responsible towards other people. So some of the traditions of ethics that are really based in the old small-scale market economy of the industrialized, earlier industrialized Europe sort of come to life again, because now people interact directly with the other guy and they have to be nice to each other. So it has a very strong positive effect on society with all this sharing. So I think it's going to see a big future, and it's a big thing.
Terribly sorry, you were next, weren't you? Yes, sorry. Can I come to you third? Okay.
With that confusion, what am I going to say? I was going to ask, what's your advice on what we do about political structures that seem to be in the way of the evolution of these kinds of models?
Since I've been arguing this kind of things for some years, I've been invited, for instance, by many local authorities to discuss what should we do in our region to make people participate more in society. And I think the answer you always have to give, which politicians don't like, is you have to take a risk. The only way you can involve people in running society is by risking that they don't do what you want them to do. So you have to be generous. You have to have self-confidence enough that you delegate something to people and run the risk that they won't clean their road or they won't shovel their snow or whatever. If you want people to self-organize and do things together, you have to give them the power to do so, the freedom to do so. And that, of course, runs contrary to the political culture we have. And the only thing you can say is that if enough people want things like this to happen, for instance, with the sharing economy, they will demand politicians to help them do that. And that's a long process, but that's the only way I see it. I think politicians are slow learners on issues like this. But the only thing that politicians respect is the electorate, the people voting for them.
In this beautiful example of this closed ecosystem, I think you could add only one thing, that this ecosystem still radiates the energy back to the environment. So it is, it's completely true. It needs just the sun as our earth. But similarly as our earth is giving back nearly the whole energy to the universe, but in another energy, the lower temperature. So I'm sure here's the similar effect. Would you agree?
Fully. And it's true that I mean, our planet needs a star.
Yeah.
But it also needs a dark sky around the star,
yes,
so we can get rid of the microwave radiation from our temperature.
Yes.
So yes, there needs to be a sink for the entropy for the microwaves.
For the used energy in this.
Exactly. It is a flow.
And let me excuse me. The second comment about the commons. At your list, one important common was missing. It is information space.
Yeah.
In fact, we are talking now about reverse strategy of common, since information we can share without the problem, but our capacities to absorb information are limited. So we should think about not, for example, sending too much emails, because we are using other people's information space. And this is the issue which now starts to be very important, I think.
That's a good point. And obviously we have to digest a little more information before we send it on to other people. And now it's so easy to just send the raw material and you get congested in that. That's a good point.
Okay. Elinor Ostrom herself was very troubled by the fact that she was never able to deal with the upscaling of her approach beyond relatively small-scale societies. a lot of what we've been talking about today, including you, including me, including others, is all about, well, how is this going to happen from now on? Can you give me a sense of how you see that happening?
That's a very good and very important question. You mentioned yourself in your talk that cities, for instance, now are more important in many ways and more constructive than countries. And I see the role of cities as an indication that somehow we are learning that we have to scale down in size to start solving these problems of like the climate problem. Because when you think about sort of the Copenhagen summit in 2009, and sort of it's getting nowhere. So mayors and cities are starting to take responsibility, and that makes it much more foreseeable that then communities or neighborhoods in cities can play a role, communities can play a role. And I think that the global connectivity of communities can play a role that would be very surprising. Last time, not this time, but I was stepping in October. I think I was stepping on the airplane to go to Singapore from Copenhagen. And on the way to the airplane, I mentioned to a guy that I was interacting with from the movement Tautomat, which is the roof tomato movement in Copenhagen. A guy who started urban farming urban agriculture by growing tomatoes on the roof of the shed or the hut for the waste bins, and this is spread like wildfire in Copenhagen, and everybody is now having tomatoes on their roofs, and it's great. And I was emailing with him, and I said, oh, I have to go now onto the airplane. I'm going to Singapore. And he said, Singapore. I know people there who came to see my tomatoes, and go see them. So even small movements that do stuff are now globally connected due to the internet and due to the globalized consciousness also. So there's a chance that many small initiatives can be connected up from the bottom rather than from the top. While just when I was a kid, any international communication, that was the red line between Khrushchev and so it's the world is different in that way. That doesn't mean it helps. It's going to happen all by itself, but it means that there's this possibility of almost instant connectivity.
There is a fundamental problem in all of that, though, and that is the question of identity. The fact that any community, any group, as long as we know, actually also had the need to distinguish itself by creating an identity. So what you're asking is that we recreate identities in a very different way. Is that right?
In a sense, yes, because I argue or I could argue that we'll have many identities because we will have many networks. 200 years ago, the network of atoms, the food, the kids, the caretaking of the elderly, would be the same as the network of work, of communication, of the local newspaper. That would be all in the same. Nowadays, you can live in a network of atoms where you grow your vegetables, your tomatoes, thank you, and you take care of your kids and the elderly in a very, very local fashion, with people you actually look in the eye and know. And then at the same time, you can be part of an international global conversation over the internet on your interest in the moons of Saturn or something weird. So we have the possibility now of being at many different levels at the same time. And that, I think, will help for a very particular reason. There was a wonderful Chinese study of empathy for pain. People in Europe have been studying the empathy for pain. If you see your romantic partner getting an electric shock, you will have activity in the same part of your brain as the partner has, because you see the pain being inflicted and you reproduce the pain. In Beijing, they studied how Chinese would look at a westernized face that was having a needle through the chin, and how Western people would look at the Chinese with a needle through the pin. And it turns out that the immediate reaction is, if the guy with the other ethnicity has the needle through the chin, you don't feel empathy, but you do it if it's your same kind of guy. This is a little frightening. So they immediately made a study, what will change this? And it turns out if you don't see the white guy as a white guy, but as a Bill or Peter, you will empathize with his pain. While if you see him just as white or just as Chinese, you will not empathize. Which means that the moment we interact, we start empathizing. So the more interconnectivity, the more we will, in a biologically and objectively measurable way, we will not be as outgroupish to these people as we were before. So I think there's hope, but I agree that it's not a simple thing.
Thank you.
I think we might have to make this the last question.
Okay. First of all, just a brief comment that urban mining of the type you described has, of course, occurred in the past. Medieval and Renaissance Rome was largely built out of Rome, very interestingly. And whole Chinese palaces have been moved around the landscape, but that's not my focus. It relates to one thing, is that the industrialized world, on your description, has an enormous amount of asset stored in what it's built. And huge portions of the rest of the world do not. Also, 50% of humankind now lives in cities, and the vast majority of those people who live in cities are new arrivals. So they are literally constituting the communities that they're coming into. As a result, talking about that issue, what you're envisaging is something that we might be able to develop in the developed world. What is going to happen on a planet where there are disparities between different regions of the world, where Time magazine has just remarked that civil society has largely collapsed in the central area of Southwest Asia? Africa, African societies are clearly not likely to go straight to what you've been describing. They've got to go through some other path. What do you see the world looking like if some of us can do what you're saying and a whole lot of other people can't?
First of all, if you take like the case of copper, if there's still half the copper available in the copper mines, then it would be nice if people like you and me and our societies said, okay, we had the copper that we ever should have, and the rest is for people building new societies. And that would certainly help if we didn't sort of just go on and expand all the time. So that would help. The question of civil society, of course, and the collapse of civil society, which is a major issue, obviously. But also my experience from last year, I was talking to a group of African countries that were interested in civil society, and my impression was that there was a strong sense that there's still enough that you can make it survive. But it's like biodiversity. It's something that if it goes away, it's more difficult to reestablish. But if it's there, you have to nourish it and to take care of it. And of course, the flux into cities is a big problem. There are many big problems on this planet. But perhaps solving problems locally and concretely and specifically is easier than designing big schemes, because that's not going to happen anyway.
We might have to wrap it up.
Yeah.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's 5 o'clock, so we should end this session. Would you like to join with me in thanking Tor for his talk? Beyond that, I'm giving this rather handsome thumbs up to present to Tor in appreciation for coming and giving us the talk today. So Tor, if you
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's a beautiful one.